Straight Talk on WRHI is brought to you by Founders Federal Credit Union. Relax, you're with Founders. Now live from Substation 2 on Cherry Road in Rock Hill, Manning Kimmel.
And a good afternoon. Welcome into Substation 2, Cherry Road across from Winthrop. My name is Manning Kimmel. The program is called Straight Talk. We do it every weekday afternoon, talking about Rock Hill, Fort Mill, TKK, the great county of York, and everything else up and down I-77. And we do it right here on WRHI, South Carolina's 7-time radio station of the year. Our broadcast presented by Founders Federal Credit Union. Relax, you're with Founders. Our thanks to our co-sponsor today, Anderson Griggs Investments at Old Town Rock Hill. Common sense, intelligent advice for conservative investors online at andersongriggs.com. And our thanks to highspeedweb.net for streaming our signal 24/7, 365. Well, with us today is the local author himself, Mr. David, I got to get this right, Manderbach, who is just put out a new book called Fake History, The American Civil War. And in the era of fake news, that seems like to be an appropriate title. Did that have anything to do with it?
A little bit. I stole it.
You stole it.
I stole the idea.
All right. So tell everybody about you, David, if you would.
Live in beautiful Fort Lawn, South Carolina, right down the road. Grew up in the area. Always interested in history. Just kept reading as a young person and growing into a not so young person.
Funny how that happens, doesn't it?
Finally, with a lot of the current events that occurred between 15 and 16 of 2000s, decided that it was time to write a book. Take all that research and curiosity and wrap it into one and put it in the form of a book.
So exactly when did you start this project?
Started the book right around the summer of 2016.
Was it more than you thought it would be?
Yes, absolutely.
And what was the hardest part, the research or the actual sitting down and making yourself right?
Well, getting it started was a little difficult, but the most difficult was the editing, the end of it. You start realizing you have too much, or not enough, and maybe this is right, maybe this is wrong, and you have to kind of go back and check yourself. But it took some time, and that's fine. So
the Civil War, obviously, they keep writing about it, and will continue to keep writing about it.
Yes.
Your angle on the book, as you say, you call it fake news.
That's right. Fake history.
Well, fake history.
Right.
Same. Right. So, were there just a lot of misrepresentations, according to what your research came up with?
Well, what's happened is, first of all, my book is looking at the Civil War and American history in general, founding of our nation, as a big picture as compared to who's to blame, who was right, who was wrong, but looking at the big picture, how it made us who we are today. So I just put it into as concise of briefing as I could.
All right.
And then fake history came from a lot of the current events were referring to the history, and you hear a lot of these, it's just not based in fact. So maybe this is a good time to bring up the facts and kind of see where it really lands us and where the curiosity might be. So most people really didn't like their history class or like to talk about history, especially politics, that type of thing. But ultimately it comes home and then they have to make a comment or have a thought about it, and it's based on some myth that's been generated out of just talk. So
what would you say was the biggest misnomer that you stumbled upon in regards to the Civil War?
Generally, it would be what the Civil War was about, and I'll do that in quotations.
Okay.
What the Civil War was about. That's a question a lot of people ask when they know that I'm interested in it, or if you look on social media that's being debated. Then it was who's to blame, and the South were a bunch of traitors, the North were a bunch of invaders, and depending on who you talk to. So ultimately, you can't put that period of time on a bumper sticker, and everyone has a feeling about these things. And you can't answer any part of it with a bumper sticker or a meme or even an argument online. You've got to really go back and just see what we're really basing our thoughts on and what really compared to what really happened.
So are you saying that the Civil War was more about something other than slavery?
Yes, it was. A lot of people don't like to hear that, but I'm certain that the war did not start over slavery, and I have the evidence to back that up. It definitely became about slavery, needed to become about slavery, but it was not initially about slavery.
Was it about economics?
Economics had a lot to do with it, but basically the way I see it is that the country was turning a page. We went from a fledgling nation that was struggling. We had all types of attacks coming from the outside, not necessarily in wars, but we had European ships off the coast. There was a lot of pressure on our country to basically fail. And through all that, economic strife, banking system was not determined, what have you. Then, of course, there were regional conflicts between the North and South. Those had been breeding. But ultimately, there was a day when we had to decide what our country really was. And I think that day was somewhere between 1856 and 1860, which ended up with the war occurring as a result of all that.
Okay, you need to give me a little bit more on that, because I'm not sure I totally follow. The country is trying to decide what it wants to be.
Right.
Whether it wants to be what versus what.
That's right. Well, basically continuing the arguments that occurred in the constitutional debates going back to early days of the nation's founding, 1787, when the Constitution was ratified. There were open debates that were never resolved. A lot of that was slavery, and that was never solved. But what you had two influences, agricultural and industrial, and those began to separate. We were getting ready to come into a revolution. The Republican Party was forming in the 1850s, and they were wise enough to see that there was industrial opportunities, and the nation was going to be a very large player in the world stage. And then the South, as a region, being agricultural, was not so involved in that, and that's where the conflict came to a head.
You know, one of the factoids that I learned in a history class right across the street here at Winthrop University that I never heard before was that Lincoln, when he was the president, was trying to work out this whole slavery issue with the southern states. And he basically told them, look, if you'll give up the expansion ideas of taking slavery to this new western territory, I can pretty much go along with that.
Right.
Well, they weren't for that. And therefore, boom, that was a big, big reason for him.
That's right.
To move forward. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I do. I do. You know, that transposed, with a little more detail to get more exact about it, it's transposed from Lincoln making his first inaugural speech in March of 61, and endorsing an amendment. It was called the Corwin Amendment. That was a solution that a lot of the politicians had generated at that time in order to appease the South and keep them from seceding. So Lincoln went from that angle to, by the time he had his second inauguration in March of 1864, of standing on the fact that slavery needed to be resolved and be ended. So there was a progression from that time.
All right, so the biggest conclusion you reached in your book, again, the book is called Fake History of the American Civil War.
That's right.
Was the overall reason why the Civil War started. It was not all about slavery.
That's a lot of it. It's not all about that, but that's a lot of it.
You're just saying we were just going through a period trying to figure out who the heck we were.
That's right.
And what we wanted to be. We had unsettled issues from the Constitution, which, even though by that time was almost 100 years in place, right?
Yeah.
So, okay. What else did you pick up from this?
Just a lot, a lot of curious pieces. Looking at how, I'll touch on some military things and the personalities of the folks involved. The people we know, Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, the differences in their backgrounds and what have you, and what they supported. There was a lot of, from the military standpoint, there was a lot of those personalities that were against the war but were forced into it. And there was a lot of folks in the North that were sympathetic to the South, but they had a job to do as well. And also with the way the media was at that time and how it was used by Lincoln. Lincoln was a master politician, there's no question, and he knew how to work the media. And the media was not the free press that we know today.
Well, one of the things I was reading here just the last week or so, that we talk about the present administration, Donald Trump, and his relationship with the media.
Right.
Lincoln's was not a whole lot better. And in fact, when people disagree with him, he would arrest them.
That's right. Over 12,000 newspaper men were arrested.
Yeah. So,
which goes back to why the need of the book is there. And there are 16,000 books written on the period of the Civil War that are published that at last count. And I'm sure that's changing by the day. But the fact is, there's very little that was reported to us objectively because the media was so scrutinized. And basically, if you printed anything outside of the Lincoln administration's wants and wishes and policies, you were apt to be imprisoned.
You know, another thing that I learned from these history classes that I took was the politics back in the 60s was just as vitriolic as it is today. I mean, they hammered each other. The difference being they didn't have a 24/7 media that churned it all the time. But they were very robust debates, very sharp encounters.
Yes, sir.
A lot of name calling, a lot of everything under the sun. So it is the American system, I guess.
Sounds like you had a lot of the same studies I had when I was across the street.
That guy over there
You're
by the
right.
name of Jason Silverman.
You're right.
So, all right, so you got a lot of military things out of your research that you tried to straighten out. What else did you find? I mean, the book you wrote this book because you've studied American history a long time, and you just felt there was a bunch of stuff about the Civil War that never had been stated. Is that basically
Particularly,
right?
yes, sir.
All right. So take me through a list of some of these things.
Well, the one curious question I had that I wanted to address through my life or learn about, and then I ended up writing about, was what happened to the slave refugees. We look at, those of us today, we look back and we read the book that in 1865 the war was over, slaves were freed, that's it, period. But nothing is that easy. So you think about the logistics of freeing 4 million people that had never been free before. They didn't know what freedom meant. We probably didn't know what freedom meant in a lot of ways, but
right.
We had no social programs available or any support system at all, and there was no plan in place when the slaves were becoming refugees into freedom in order to take care of them. There was a lot of rampant disease and death to great numbers that really was never properly reported because of the media problems of that time.
So what did you find out happened to the refugees?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to defer to a fellow named Jim Downs, wrote a book called
Sick from Freedom.
Okay.
Where he addresses it. Now, I did back a lot of this out in my own research, but basically they went into the woods and they tried to follow, wherever the food went. And a lot of that was in the invading northern forces as they were coming south in the later years of the war, mid to later years of the war. They were able to follow the Army. Problem was the Army didn't carry the supplies to handle everybody. So ultimately a lot of these people were just not cared for, and starvation and disease and lack of personal care just set in, and there was a large number of deaths. And I think that's been glossed over that we need to really be concerned about.
4 million slave refugees, as you call them.
They were freed.
And these were people who never had the opportunity for an education.
That's right.
Had been, in bondage essentially for all these years.
That's right.
They're set free by the war. Where do we go? What do we do?
Exactly.
Where are we going to work?
Exactly.
All we know is, working out in the fields.
Yes. It's a little surprising to me that as I did my research, because as I got curious, I would directly look for it, but there's very little or hardly any record of any government-sponsored assistance going in behind the armies in order to care for the refugee slaves.
Right.
And it's surprising they didn't make room for that. Most of the folks that really handled that were individuals, abolitionists, church leaders, things to that effect.
And then, of course, we had a war-torn South that the Union had just crushed with the post-war, you're going to do this, you do this, do this. There was no tolerance at all at that time for the black race to integrate itself into the white society.
That's right.
It wasn't there.
That's
okay.
Right.
All right, we're going to take our mid-program break. Remind you that you are listening to Straight Talk, live from Substation 2, Cherry Road across from Winthrop, presented by Founders Federal Credit Union. Relax, you're with Founders. Our thanks to our co-sponsor today, Anderson.